Everybody. Finally made some time to get around to completing this little investigation into the Port Arthur Massacre. So, yeah, let's jump straight into it. Okay. Part 3. So, Tuesday morning, the day after Martin Bryant's arrest. This is like prior to any investigation, prior to any, real collation and study of all the witness testimony, prior to anything that should be proving anybody guilty of anything at this stage. But that didn't matter because on Tuesday morning, the Hobart Mercury, the Herald Sun, the Australian, the Advertiser, the Daily Telegraph, the Courier Mail, and the NT News all showed a big picture of Martin Bryant on the front page with titles saying things like, "This is the man," or "This man is Martin Bryant," implying that he was responsible for the massacre, completely compromising any chance of a fair trial and potentially contaminating eyewitness accounts of the gunman. All 7 papers, it's worth noting, belong to Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. There's your globalist / Rockefeller tie-in. Long-term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In that picture there, you can see him attending the World Economic Forum's, whatever, where they get around and discuss what they're going to do, what kind of propaganda they're going to, put out into the world through corporations like that. Nothing to do with facts, nothing to do with truth, nothing to do with reality. Okay. So, after the massacre, the Tasmania Police set up a task force under Superintendent Johnston to investigate the Port Arthur Massacre. One of the task force members investigating the Port Arthur Massacre stated to witnesses that it was the SOG, the Special Operations Group, that set fire to the BMW so as to negate its use to the persons inside Seascape Cottage as a means of escape. Now, remember, this was never put in any of the official reports. It was assumed that it was Martin Bryant. And the only SOG member present at that time was Sergeant Andrew Mark Fogarty. Top picture of those two on the right. The police task force member also stated that it was the same SOG member who set fire to Seascape Cottage. Both fires were started by Andrew Fogarty with flares. This contradicts the official narrative that presumes Bryant to be responsible for both fires. Sorry, repeating myself there. It does not, however, conflict with the statement made by Superintendent Bob Fielding in the picture below there, who said, quote, "At the end of the day, I'm satisfied that we made the right decision in forcing him to come to us as opposed to vice versa." So there you go. The SOG, well, specifically Andrew Fogarty, set fire to the BMW and to Seascape Cottage, and that is confirmed by Bob Fielding in his statement. Now, the burning of the BMW and of Seascape Cottage destroyed vitally important evidence. This tells us one of two things about Sergeant Andrew Mark Fogarty. Either he is the most useless, pathetic, and incompetent individual ever recruited by the Tasmania Police, who is incapable of conducting proper police work, as he appears to have a tendency towards destroying crucial evidence, or alternatively, he is in fact a highly competent individual, as you'd expect him to be, occupying a position such as the one he does, fully capable of conducting proper police work, who intentionally destroyed evidence he knew would cause problems by contradicting the narrative that was to be peddled to the Australian people after the fact, courtesy of Rupert Murdoch's propaganda machinery. You know, which one of those two could it possibly be? Now, on the 23rd of June, 1996, the Sunday Herald Sun published an article in which a man named Bill Drysdale of Yass, Victoria, said he believes the rifle, an AR-15, which was allegedly used at Port Arthur, was the same one he once owned. Another member of that same Tasmania Police task force, Inspector Maxwell, travelled up to Victoria to speak with Bill Drysdale regarding the AR-15, which was considered to be one of the two murder weapons, quote unquote. Bill Drysdale identified that firearm by the gunsmith's mark on the barrel as the AR-15 that had previously belonged to him. This particular firearm had been handed to the Victoria Police in 1993 when it was made illegal. The AR-15s that had been handed to the Victoria Police during this amnesty were then issued to the Victoria Police SOG to be used by them until they were issued with new weapons in 1994. These AR-15s were then sold to a Bendigo gun dealer for sale overseas, all except one, the compact AR-15 that had once been the property of Bill Drysdale. It went through the police books as being destroyed at Sims Metal Furnace, but somehow, miraculously, ended up at Seascape Cottage after the siege instead. However, the AR-15 was damaged in such a way that it could not have been the weapon used at Port Arthur. The rifles, both of them, were destroyed by breech blasts, so ballistics tests could not be carried out to identify the murder weapons. Breech blasts that could destroy a gun are so rare as to be unheard of this century. Well, last century. If Bryant had have been handling the weapon when the bridge exploded, he'd have been deafened for up to a couple of days, but his hearing was not affected when he was arrested at Seascape. The official report tells us that Bryant was held in Royal Hobart Hospital under heavy police guard while awaiting trial. In his police interview, Bryant denied shooting any person. He also claimed he did not take the BMW from the vicinity of the toll booth and that his hostage was taken from the BMW. He said that he thought the man he took hostage must have died in the boot when the car exploded. He did not distinguish between the car fire and the later house fire. He also totally denied visiting the Port Arthur historic site that day. So, you know, he doesn't know what's going on, basically. Now, on the 24th of April, 1994, the Hobart Supreme Court found that Martin Bryant was incompetent to handle his own affairs. And we touched on this earlier, but this set the legal precedent that Bryant was held by the Hobart Supreme Court to be incompetent to make any plea. Once a person has been found incompetent to plead, the court can only accept a plea of not guilty. On the 15th, on the 15th of October, 1996, a letter was sent from the DPP to Mrs. Wendy Skerr. In it, Damien Bugg, that reprehensible creature pictured under Wendy there, and another fella, Nick Perk, stated the following, quote, We have examined files of witness statements and concluded that your evidence contained in your statement taken by police, whilst helpful in the investigation and the consideration of issues in this matter, will not be necessary in the trial of Martin Bryant. End quote. Now, a police video, which is online, exists, which proves the police had an excellent opportunity to get DNA samples and fingerprints of the gunman. The video shows the blue sports bag on one of the cafe tables. The gunman had carried his 3 firearms in this bag and left it right next to his drinking glass, his can of Solo, his knife and fork, his plate, and video camera. Were these items used by police for DNA samples and fingerprints to confirm or deny that Martin Bryant was in fact the shooter? Nope. They weren't. They were ignored. After an event like this, there should have been a coronial inquiry. There should have been one by law. A coronial inquiry is required when A, foreign nationals are killed, and B, when there are deaths by fire. Both requirements were met. So why was the law broken to prohibit the inquiry? Well, a coronial inquiry was denied by the Howard government because it would be, quote, too hurtful for the victims' families, end quote. Those are the words of John Howard. Anyone who buys that absolute bollocks needs to get their head examined, because victims want closure. They want answers. They want their questions answered, and they want closure. They do not want something as controversial as this swept under the rug by the state. And that's exactly what happened. Following the massacre, the Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, led the development of strict gun control laws within Australia and formulated a national firearms agreement restricting the private ownership of semi-automatic rifles, semi-automatic shotguns, and pump-action shotguns, as well as introducing uniform firearms licensing. There's that pattern again. Initially, Bryant pleaded not guilty to the 35 murders and did not provide a confession. However, Bryant changed his plea to guilty for a court hearing on the 19th of November 1996, where he was found guilty of all charges. The judge then ordered that all evidence for the case be sealed. On the 22nd of November, Bryant was sentenced to 35 sentences of life imprisonment for each count of murder and sentenced to 25 years for the remaining 36 charges on 5 other offences. All sentences are to be served concurrently in Hobart's Risdon prison, where he remains in solitary confinement and is not permitted any visitors other than his immediate family. Why would that be? I do wonder. His prison papers indicate that he is never to be released, and he continues to serve his term without possibility of parole. This is very rare in Australia, where the majority of murder sentences allow for the possibility of parole after a long prison term. Now, reading that passage could leave you with the impression that Martin Bryant actually stood trial, and he did not. And, you know, you might want to think about why it isolates someone to that degree. So, in the committal hearing at the Hobart Supreme Court on September 30th, 1996, Martin Bryant pleaded not guilty to the 72 charges relating to the Port Arthur Massacre. And keep in mind that Bryant had been held in police custody for 5 months at this point. 5 months. His solicitor, Lieutenant Colonel David Gunson, stepped aside, and a lawyer by the name of John Avery, pictured on the right, stepped forward to represent Martin Bryant. After 2 months of threatening Bryant's mother and using her as leverage against him, Martin Bryant pleaded guilty, and he was sentenced in November of 1996. This guy is one ginormous, just absolute, I don't even want to, I'll just keep it chill. So here's some quotes from John Avery, just so you can get a sense of the kind of character you're dealing with here. Not that his face tells you everything you need to know. Quote, "I think there is a case where the rights of this community may have to be considered to be more important than the rights of an individual." End quote. There's that, delusional collectivism, creeping in. No, your job is to defend your client, you fucking idiot. Simple as that. All right, quote, "I had nothing to offer in the legal sense. I never let him think I had anything to offer. I regularly said to him, 'You're going to jail for life and you are never going to get out,'" end quote. Yeah. Wow. What amazing defense. Unbelievable. Outstanding. And this fucking piece of shit, John Avery, well known for defending Port Arthur gunman Martin Bryant, found himself behind bars in 2008 when he pleaded guilty to misappropriation as a company officer and 129 counts of stealing. He stole over $500,000 from his clients and colleagues at his firm, Avery Partners. He was sentenced to 6 years jail, ordered to compensate his victims, and was removed from the lawyer's register. So these are the kinds of scum bags that you will dig up doing a little bit of research, don't have to do much, into controversial things like the Port Arthur Massacre. Criminals, scumbags, giant pieces of shit that end up in prison themselves. People with no integrity and no intention to, there was never any intention to defend Bryant, at all. So we'll just look at some coincidences. Let's just call them that. So that kind of wraps up at least the events that took place over those 2 days, and then a little bit of info on what went down afterwards and up to Bryant's, imprisonment. So we'll just jump back prior to Port Arthur here, and that in June 1995, the Southern District Mortuary Service purchased a specially built refrigerated 22 body capacity hearse. It was the only one of its kind in the whole of Australia, and it just happened to be conveniently sitting in the south of Tasmania, right on call. It was used only once at Port Arthur, and then it was put up for sale online, and there it is, and there's the ad. Another amazing coincidence. Now, this fella, Ray Groom, November 1995, as Attorney General, he removed the right for any worker or volunteer to claim compensation related to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from the Workers' Compensation Act, the main injury resulting from the Port Arthur Massacre. Since then, several victims have suicided and no victims were compensated. Wow. The coincidences are endless. Here's another one. from Robin Cooper, who was the former manager of the visitors services, at the Port Arthur historic site. She said at 11 a.m. on the day of the massacre, 10 managers, the 10 of the senior managers and supervisors left the site on their way to a conference at Swansea, a conference that none of them really knew what it was about, by the way, and that was never held. So this was the first time, she says, in my 20 years that I am aware of, where all the senior management had been involved in a conference/training session away from the Port Arthur historic site, which required an overnight stay Sunday through Monday. Okay. So none of them were, in danger of losing their lives that day, because what an inconvenience that would have been for the, Port Arthur historic site management. Can't have that. So here's another one, and they're just endless. So there was many staff, doctors, and ambulance personnel at the Royal Hobart Hospital who didn't respond at all until they saw the event being reported on the news. Over the previous weeks, the hospital had been introducing a new Code Brown, a disaster emergency response plan involving multiple casualties, that was completed on the 28th of April. So it was fresh in everybody's mind. Wow, the convenience, unreal. And when the call came in that there was a massacre at Port Arthur, they thought it was another drill. And how often do we hear that about drills and, training operations going on when things like this are happening at the same time or just prior to the event? So the Royal Hobart Hospital also were able to call on the services of 25 trauma specialist doctors from all over Australia that were part of the Royal Australian College of Surgeons, who had just completed a seminar at midday that afternoon. And the last lecture had been in relation to terrorist attacks and gunshot wounds. Now, in the previous, in part 2, we mentioned WASPs, this term WASPs being used by the shooter. And we had this bizarre casualties of ASIO, intelligence spooks. What on earth were they doing in Port Arthur that day? Why is there dead Australian intelligence officers, agents, whatever, at the scene? Never mentioned in any official anything. Well, here's why they're going to try and, bump, squeeze, and get Wendy Skerr out of the picture, because she's important. She's a central, figure in this whole story. And she, if what she had to say was reach the Australian public, it would have hugely just pulled the rug from under the propaganda that was being peddled through the mainstream media. So now the WASPs and the intelligence spooks and the 2 busloads of American tourists, Wendy has this to say. She said, "I do not believe they were ever expected to arrive at Port Arthur on that day," referring to the 2 busloads of tourists. Which is very unusual, as mostly all bus tours were booked for their different tours, etc., many days prior. It is very hard to slot in 70 extra people. That many tourists would mean an extra 2 guides would be needed, as there was a limit of 35 people per walking hour. I was speaking to Mrs. Anne Hamilton, who was in charge of the tour office. When I arrived from the ferry trip to eat my lunch, she said that 2 busloads of American tourists had arrived unexpectedly and that they wanted to do a trip on the ferry, Bundina, at 1:30 p.m., the time that the shooting started. Prior to Easter, the ferry was going out at least every half hour, doing 8 trips per day around the harbour, as every person who purchased a ticket to tour Port Arthur historic, the Port Arthur historic site, was given in the price charged this complimentary tour of the harbour. The Isle of the Dead, which was a small island off the mainland, was the convict burial ground, and we took a 1-hour tour over there between 12 and 1 p.m. and 3 and 4 p.m. On this day, I had returned from my trip to the island at 1 p.m. and the ferry was tied up until 2 p.m. These tourists were booked on a tour of the harbour at 2:30 p.m., an extra tour put on for them by Anne, as they were not expected. We believe they were to be the targets on the 1:30 p.m. sailing that didn't happen. So the shooting venue was changed to the Broad Arrow Cafe at 1:30 p.m. It had to happen at 1:30 exactly, as there were so many plans in place, and I believe that these people were part of the plan to be killed out on the ferry Bundina. Now that accounts for these anomalies. That makes sense. That is rational. Hence why you never heard anything about any of that. Hence why Wendy Skerr, why you haven't heard of her either, even though she'd be one of the key witnesses. So, knowing all that, these 3, corrupt lawyer John Avery, corrupt prosecutor Damien Bugg, and corrupt judge William Cox, with no hesitation, no investigation, and no trial, sent a mentally handicapped boy man to prison, never to be released, where he is now being slowly tortured and poisoned to death with psychiatric drugs and is held in solitary confinement indefinitely. So, what can we say about this? I started with creating a context for all that I've covered here. And so now we can ask this question. Having looked at the evidence, having looked at the facts, is what we are seeing consistent with a spontaneous, unexpected, freak event? Yeah, is Martin Bryant even capable of committing any part of any of that? Or is what we're seeing part of a highly organized plan? There was multiple prior warnings from Australian politicians. There was the removal of post-traumatic stress disorder from the Workers' Compensation Act. There's a 22 body capacity hearse ordered by the Tasmania Mortuary Services. The 10 senior managers are evacuated from site just prior to the shooting. The local police are decoyed prior to the shooting. We have 7 dead intelligence spooks, never mentioned, never explained, never accounted for. We have the Code Brown emergency plan implemented at Royal Hobart Hospital, running for weeks prior to the event and is completed on that day, along with the Royal Australian College of Surgeons being able to send those guys down to the hospital. I didn't mention this, but there was a media conference where there was media personnel from all over the world attending this conference. There was hundreds of them, and 80 of them were discharged down to Port Arthur on the day. And then they unleashed their story to the world before anyone knows anything. The story is ready to go before any investigation is done at all, before any witness testimony has been, verified or anything. We have the shooting time in the cafe altered. Why? Well, we explained why. Witness statements contradicted or omitted from the official report. Damaged murder weapons. Can't even verify if these were the guns used to commit any crimes. We have key witnesses totally dismissed. Evidence ignored or destroyed. No coronial inquiry, no trial, nothing that has anything to do with justice or truth or integrity, nothing. What do we have? We have gun legislation passed into law. We have the disarmament of the nation, the weakening of the nation, the destruction of individual rights, the destruction of private property rights, and the unbelievable compromising of the capacity for self-defense. That is what is consistent with the facts. We have the engineering of consent. That's what we have. The Australian people complying with their own, with the destruction of all those things I just previously mentioned. This is what the method created by Edward Bernays looks like in practice. Yes, there are evil people in this world who study, human psychology. And unlike a therapist who would be using this knowledge for good or for healing, they use it to exploit. They use it to destroy. They use it to subvert and to, really exploit the average person's virtues and values, because obviously nobody wants to see massacres in the world. But destroying people's private property rights, individual rights, and ability to defend themselves isn't a solution to the problem, especially when the problem has been manufactured. You have an enemy. You have enemies in this world. And it's time to kind of realize how they operate. So for anyone who has followed my attempt, my very humble and amateur attempt to convey and share my research into this particular event, anyone who wants to look further into this, these people here need to be investigated, basically. Michael Charles Dyson, the former commanding officer of the Tasmania Police and Tasmania Police Special Operations Group, massive questions about him. Where the hell was he during that siege at Seascape Cottage? And was he the shooter inside? Then we have these other three: Hans Overbeek, Warren Overbeek, and Benjamin Overbeek is on the bottom right Warren next to him. Hans is their father, apparently. There's really not much out there to dig up on these guys. Although Hans Overbeek was interviewed in, what was it, Who Weekly or some gossip magazine back in the 90s. And he was given some bravery award. All three of these guys are meant to have been at Port Arthur at the historic site on the day. Hans says that he was there with both his sons. None of them provided a witness testimony. And from some of the books I've looked at and some of the forums online, it is believed that Benjamin Overbeek was the shooter at the Broad Arrow Cafe. And apparently Benjamin Overbeek committed suicide a couple of months following the Port Arthur massacre. So I will leave it there for now. I hope there's been some insights and values, valuable insights, I should say. And, I'd hope to have piqued an interest in this research, especially with this occasion, because it's monumental. And those corrupt lawyers, judges, and attorneys, well, I'm not sure about the judge, but I know the other two, they're still employed, working down there in Tasmania, as is Andrew Fogarty, still employed by the Tasmanian Police Force. I find that disgusting, reprehensible beyond comprehension. And Martin Bryant still rotting away in jail. And I find that just tragic, absolutely tragic. The destruction of that man's life and of his family without there being a proper investigation. If there was a proper investigation conducted and he was found guilty, then, man, absolutely, you need to pay for the damage you have inflicted 100%. I'm not negating that at all, but I am pointing out that that's not what happened. And that when we look at his psychological profile, impossible for him to have done any of that. He is not some terrorist mastermind. He's not some mass killer. He was like a child. The ideal person to frame as a patsy, the ideal person that you could exploit and take advantage of, but not someone that could achieve any of that. And even if he started, he probably would have fallen into a heap after he'd fired the first shot. So yes, psychological warfare, it's a thing. Social engineering, it's a thing. And the engineering of consent by the Edward Bernays types of this world, coming out of Tavistock and whatever, think tanks are out there now that are just working on this 24/7, feeding you absolute BS. I mean, just think of the last 2 years, absolute unverified crap that has nothing to do with facts and nothing to do with reality. And, but it does influence groups and it appeals to group psychology. That's why they don't tell you any of this stuff, because you don't need to know it. That they know how to pull the levers that mobilize the mob, the unthinking, uninformed, ignorant masses, and engineer their consent. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. If you've got any questions, if you've got any comments, please leave them below. And if you enjoyed this content and want to hear more, please like or subscribe to my channel. It'd be much appreciated. So until next time, I'm going to say thanks, and I'll see you then. Cheers, guys.